Hi everyone, welcome to ESG Decoded. This is Amanda Hsieh. I have today with me Lauren Mechak, the Director of Program Development at ClimeCo, to talk a bit about carbon offsets and the carbon offset markets. Lauren, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Amanda. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you on because I think there's a lot of questions around what are carbon offsets, why carbon offsets. So I thought we could spend a little bit of time today talking just through that a little bit. Will you tell folks just a little bit about yourself and then we can get into what are offsets?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the Director of Program Development at ClimeCo, and what that means basically is I start at the very early end of new carbon offset projects. So if somebody has a great idea on how they want to either create a new decarbonized project or product, if they want to, for example, do a retrofit on an industrial facility that will reduce a lot of emissions, my team will take a look at it, see if it makes sense and fits in sort of the framework of high quality carbon offsets, which we can talk about in a little bit, and then do the sort of diligence, financing, and contracting associated with the project. So all the wacky new ideas come to me.
Awesome. So what are carbon offsets in a nutshell?
Yeah, that's a great starting question. So a carbon offset, there's a couple different types, but I think today just focusing on the ones that are happening in the voluntary market. There's also some that might be associated with a regulatory requirement, such as in California. But in the voluntary market, a carbon offset basically means a project that is created to reduce emissions but has essentially no other reason to do that emission reduction except to sell it as an offset credit. So you're incentivizing the reduction or avoidance of a ton of CO2 equivalent emitted in one place. So then it can then be sold to another company that wants to claim that they've offset the emissions profile of their company. So you might see a airline that says that you can offset your emissions of your travel. Somewhere down the road, somebody's done a lot of work to make sure that the trees that were planted or the abatement equipment that was installed was properly quantified and audited. Then that is a true reduction in emissions. Does that make sense?
That does. I think there's a lot of questions around what's the purpose of offsets, or why should we use them? And I know recently you had an article published, and I thought it might be good for listeners. And we'll link the article in the show notes to everyone so you can read it as well. But I thought it might be good just to have a little discussion around kind of the why behind all of this, and love to hear from you. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's been such an interesting time in the carbon offset space. I think there's a lot of new investors that want to participate in the market. There are buyers that are considering today, like, do I want to buy carbon offsets as part of my decarbonization journey? Do I want to even perhaps participate as a seller in the carbon offset market? And there's also a lot of organizations that are really kind of putting the lens very closely and scrutinizing the carbon offset market. And I think that's good. I think quality standards should always be improving. But with all this attention, as you mentioned, Amanda, sometimes it can be kind of missing the whole picture of, why are we even doing this in the first place, and why are these good tools? And for me, it kind of came down to 3 points, which, as you mentioned in the article, I outlined. So the first, and for me, perhaps the most salient, is that it really funnels money from a company that maybe can't decarbonize its footprint completely today to something that can do a really meaningful emission reduction, but doesn't have those incentives. So there's a couple different examples of that. We have a lot of projects that essentially destroy refrigerants that would have been emitted to the atmosphere anyway, because they're a waste product that are in like old refrigerators or old pieces of industrial equipment. And they might be in like a waste dumping site. And there's really no reason for anyone to go out and collect those gases. They'll just leak into the atmosphere. And because of the power of offsets, they've actually created this whole market for people to go out and collect that gas so it can be destroyed. And not only are they collecting that gas so it can be destroyed, they're also creating new technology that optimizes the collection of that gas. So I think that's a really exciting story because they've essentially used the power of private sector financing to create innovation in a space that really had no other reason to do that. And that can be extended to tree planting events, really mass restoration of ecosystems, to technology advances at industrial facilities that may not have, again, no regulatory requirements, probably not the same investor pressure that you might see at a big publicly traded company, and probably not really any market premium to decarbonize their product either. So I think the ability to take finance that wants to find a place to help the environment and put it in these areas that really need it and are available today accelerates the climate transition in such a meaningful way. So for me, that's perhaps the most exciting.
I think in the example that you gave of like with the refrigerants, if it wasn't for offsets, there'd be no reason for anyone to try to reclaim them. And we're talking about some gases that I think some of us may remember contribute, of course, to global warming, but also I think a long time ago, the hole in the ozone is our ozone layer as well, if anyone remembers that from back in the days.
Yeah.
So I think, like you said, it's those market-based solutions that actually facilitate this movement of capital.
Definitely. And those gases too, some of them are like thousands of times more potent than just CO2. You know, we hear a lot about methane, but there's a lot of gases that are even orders of magnitude worse than methane. And that means even in really small volumes, it's super impactful to abate them.
I think another point that you made in your article is how not only are there benefits and as far as helping to incentivize and move this transition along, but there's also benefits and kind of connections to like sustainable development. Mm-hmm. Talk more about that.
Yeah, so that's the next point that I had. Historically, offsets have been viewed as a mechanism to move money. Again, a lot of it's about moving money from countries like the United States, areas like Europe, to areas that are developing and helping transition those economies in a sustainable way. And I want to be careful here because, to be honest, some of that history has not been perfect when it comes to carbon offsets. It's done perhaps without community engagement or the appropriate incentives to make sure everybody was treated fairly. But I think when the appropriate safeguards are in place, you really can provide funding towards projects that will help impact the health of local communities. So we think about clean cook stove projects that remove the indoor air pollution that a lot of folks experience day to day and transition them to something that's a lot safer for their family and their environment, while also giving them usually a share of the credit value. So it creates positive health impacts and also, positive financial impacts. It can also be a job creation opportunity in some communities. So we actually have a project in Indonesia that does mangrove restoration, and that has created jobs for the community and helped them restore these shrimp ponds that were degraded historically and aren't operating appropriately without the full mangrove ecosystems. So now it's a system that has kind of job creation, food security, and also a whole, economic program that goes way beyond the ton of CO2e that's being sequestered by those mangroves. So the sustainable development aspect of it can be really exciting when it's done carefully and thoughtfully, and also kind of in the broader context of the country that you're working in.
And just for our listeners who aren't familiar with mangrove restoration, will you just tell listeners a little bit about what that is?
Yeah. So in regions where the mangroves have been degraded, either because they've been removed for charcoal production or sometimes impacted by natural disasters, we have a program where the community will harvest the mangrove, the little kind of baby mangrove seedlings, and move them into those degraded areas after letting them grow up a little bit in a nursery, so they have a much better shot at surviving versus kind of the natural regeneration that the site kind of has already proven over several years is not going to do on its own, and transferring it to those degraded areas.
I think it's a really neat project, and I feel like we have a video on that too. So if we do, I'll make sure we link it in our show notes as well, so people can watch that inspiring video. Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah,
I think. What's another reason of why carbon offsets?
Yeah. So the one final point that I think people need to be really thoughtful about is that it does allow companies continue to pollute in the short term. So the offset credit itself is offsetting an emission that a company is still doing. And most companies will pair those up 1-to-1. So I'll say, I have an emissions footprint of 100,000 tons a year, so I'm going to purchase 100,000 offsets. And in the meantime, I still continue to emit 100,000 tons a year. And I think no company should be doing that without also trying to decarbonize their footprint. I think offsets are an excellent tool in the transition, but certainly the scope 1, your actual responsibility and emissions, should be a company's priority. And I think offsets are really good because acknowledging that, even if a company does everything it can to decarbonize, the fact of the matter is there's a lot of sectors and a lot of areas in a company's footprint that they just cannot fully decarbonize today. We can't not fly on planes anymore. We can't not have, even if you have an electric vehicle, you're still using grid electricity that is not 100% renewable. So just the way our economy works today, we're still having emissions. So if you want to take responsibility for those emissions today that you can't quite cut down, and again, funnel that money into an area that can cut down the emissions, it helps accelerate the transition as you get to net zero. Because I think ultimately we want to be in a place where everybody is responsible for 100% of their own emissions as soon as they can. Because I think, I think we're all aware of the IPCC report that came out recently that I believe says we need to peak by 2025. So, that
maybe not everyone's
like
familiar with it, so give a quick
overview. Yeah.
Maybe not everyone's familiar, so give a quick 101 on that.
Yeah, so the IPCC is the scientific authority that most international bodies acknowledge and is the basis of, the Paris Agreement and a lot of the work that climate scientists do. And they recently put out a study, I believe it came out in either late March or early April, saying that for us to reach our 1.5 degree Celsius goal, as outlined by the Paris Agreement, we need to peak our emissions by 2025. And that is so soon, right? That's so soon. And we need action today and we need action now. So I think offsets are one of the ways that these companies that cannot necessarily address 100% of their emissions today participate in that decarbonization faster, since that deadline is like right around the corner.
Our window of opportunity is definitely closing in on us, and I think that was reiterated on another webinar that I was on of basically this: we still have time to take action, but it's really not a lot of time anymore, and that's just to get to 1.5 and really avoid the worst effects of climate change. It still means we're going to have days like this. I don't know how it is where you are, but in Houston, Texas, it's pretty hot this summer. And I think I just heard on the news that London in the UK is expecting temperatures over 100 degrees this week. So that's not going to be pleasant for the Londoners at all.
It's I think 100 and maybe just about 100 degrees or like 99 degrees today in Denver. So yeah, it's pretty clear that
it's been a warm, dry summer
changing.
For us.
Yeah.
I just wanted to go back to a point that you made and this is the same advice that we give as well in our ESG advisory, of where do offsets fit it into your overall decarbonization strategy? And it is, of course, a tool in the toolbox to use. But just wanted to kind of reiterate what you had mentioned, that we still, our advice is to do what you can to address your scope 1 emissions, which are your emissions from direct operations, and also your scope 2, which is your emissions from purchased electricity, and then trying to dig in, slowly through your scope 3 or your value chain emissions. And as you mentioned, offsets are a wonderful tool to use as part of that overall strategy. But we've seen it where the backlash for companies who just try to offset it all And then the scrutiny basically becomes, well, that's good. You've done a one-time thing. That's good. Now, what about the rest? And are you taking this, seriously, or just trying to buy your way out of it? So just wanted to reiterate that's the advice that we're giving our clients as well.
Yeah, it's an everything and solution.
What do you see as kind of the future of the markets?
Oh, that's a great question, Amanda. I think
we can go to another question too.
No, I can answer it. I see the markets continuing to grow. I think there's going to be a bit of consolidation. As I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of standards that are scrutinizing the market. There's a lot of new players coming online, and I think some of those players are doing really great stuff, and some of them I think maybe have some pivots they'll need to make in order to meet the quality standard, to be honest. So I think right now it's sort of a big open sea with a lot of people operating independently, and I think we're going to have to see it come back together again under standards that we all agree are the appropriate quality metrics. And I do want to say that I do think we have good quality metrics today. I know sometimes people talk about offsets being the Wild West, and that is true in some cases, but ClimeCo's been in this business since 2009, and we've been working with groups like the Climate Action Reserve, Verra, the American Carbon Registry, and Gold Standard, and they're quite rigorous, and we know our buyers trust them a lot, and we also trust them a lot. That's not to say they're perfect, but I do think there are some large numbers of projects that the quality is already really, really there, and I think buyers can trust them.
You mentioned the quality offsets, and for someone who's new to offsets, can you talk a little bit more about that, like some of the criteria or some of the things to consider when you're evaluating the quality of an offset, or maybe some of the areas that are kind of the gray areas where it's depends on what you need or want?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the basic quality standards for offsets often come down to a few key principles. So the first is something called additionality, which is making sure that project is above and beyond business as usual. So we don't want to, again, because of that point that you are balancing these offsets one-to-one often with somebody that is still releasing emissions. You want to make sure that what you're doing really does incentivize an additional ton to either be sequestered or avoided. So this concept of additionality, making sure things are above and beyond business as usual, is really important. Next is that the offset credit is permanent. So if I plant a tree today and that tree either dies tomorrow or is cut down in 10 years, that ton of CO2 equivalent that we've sequestered might not be as meaningful as you think it is. Right? So we need to make sure that those sequestered tons are stored long term. And then there's a few other quality criteria, but I think the other one that is worthwhile for this conversation is that the quantification and the amount of the ton is measured appropriately. And I think, Amanda, that also touches on your question of what the market might need to sort out a little more. There's some sectors where the measurement and the ability is difficult. And that's not to say it's a bad project, but for example, with some of the agricultural-based offset credits, there is some controversy in the market as to how you actually measure and monitor the soil organic carbon that's been sequestered. So I think companies looking at those credits need to think about, how do I feel about the monitoring, the verification, and the measurement that happened in that project? Am I comfortable with it? Do I want to maybe buy a little more to account for the uncertainty? Do I want to balance it with other projects that have more defined measurement? So, some of our industrial projects have continuous emissions monitoring equipment that counts the amount of CO2 equivalent or N2O gas coming out of the tailpipe on like a minute by minute basis, right? So you can be very precise, and maybe it's not as many co-benefits to that project, or there's projects that might have a lot of great co-benefits, really good kind of community benefits, but the measurement is perhaps not, as precise as this highly, sensitive piece of equipment.
I think you bring up a good point of having that kind of a balanced portfolio, that it doesn't have to, the projects that you invest in, or basically that the offsets are created by, can be from a variety of projects, and kind of in the end you have this, let's say, diversified portfolio that you're working with to kind of balance out all this, by at the same time getting the CO2 equivalent offsets that you need.
Exactly.
Well, Lauren, thank you so much for spending some time with me today and kind of educating me and our listeners a bit about what are carbon offsets and really the purpose behind these markets. I think it's really fascinating. And as I mentioned, we'll link up some notes and some videos for additional resources for people. But thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Definitely, Amanda. I had a lot of fun. You have a great day too.